So I'm actually going to talk about a couple different topics as Chris talked about, including an overview of the OWRI, but I want to start out first talking about some of the crop load research that I've done, and then I'll get into talking about managing nutrients for young vines, or nutrient management for young vines. Some of you here in the room have been aware of the crop load research that we've been doing because you're active participants in the research. But I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly about, first about some of the results of different studies that I have done, and then lead into the statewide crop load project. And really the key question is whether yield really matters more than vine balance when we're talking about quality of Pinot Noir. And some of you have seen me show this graph of the yields that have been reported. I know that the statistics, the NAS statistics from the Vineyard and Winery report are not perfect, but I went back, and as this is the only data I had available to me, to look at the yields that were reported for all grape varieties, including Pinot Noir, from 1990 until 2011. I did not include any of the more recent years because we've not had the official USDA NAS reports. We've had some other ones. But basically, over that time period, there's been some ups and downs in the total yield reported. But for the most part, we see that between 1.5 and 3 tons is our range, consistently for over the past 20 plus years. When we break it down by all cultivars, the darker line on the top, that's all cultivars. The mean over that time period is 2.4 tons per acre. And for Pinot Noir, it's just over 2 tons, so 2.1. So obviously, there's a relationship there with probably year effect influencing our yields. We see we have different levels of fruit set, we have different fruitfulness, but also there's probably some management occurring that's allowing for us to be hitting this very targeted zone. So I did a survey a number of years ago to ask the industry what their yield management practices were. And the majority, 88% of the respondents on that survey said they do cluster thinning to control yield, and that's most of the time emphasized on their Pinot Noir production. So white grapes, it was all over the board what their yield management practices were, and they actually reported trying to target a range of 2 to 2.5 tons per acre for Pinot Noir. So it was very uniform in terms of their reporting. So they could either be lying or that's really what they're doing. The interesting thing is looking over the last 20 plus years, it makes sense to me in the early 90s, the late 80s, why we'd have approximately a 2 ton per acre. A lot of people reported that back then they didn't do crop thinning, they didn't adjust their yields. As we get into the 90s, into the 2000s, we have different vineyard spacings, different vineyard design, rootstocks are being planted, potentially vines can have more capacity, just because of higher fruitfulness, but we still see a stagnant reporting of yields. So there's obviously potentially more crop management occurring as we get into the later years in this reporting. So I thought most things in agriculture aren't that uniform that you can apply the same practices across all sites because people have different capacities in their site, different training systems, different abilities to grow certain vine vigor. And how can we be applying the same yield across all of those areas? And wouldn't it be better to look at this from a vine balance perspective? And a lot of times we assume everybody knows exactly what vine balance means. And in doing this survey and surveying the industry a couple of years ago, I found that there's a lot of confusion around what vine balance really means. There's confusion with wine balance, which is a totally different aspect of looking at the whole equation. But the vine balance really is, for those of us who work in vine viticulture research, is that looking at the two ends of the equation. We've got our canopy and we've got our yield. And it's really finding that balance between both of them and really defining our yields based on our capacity of the canopy. And we've got some metrics that have been identified through years of research, not only here but in other places such as Australia, and California has done a lot of work. And as well as upstate New York, Nelson Shawless was kind of a canopy management guru, and they came up with some metrics that we use today. When you look at pruning weights, for example, we want to have optimums considered 20 to 40 grams. That to me is really low compared to any of the pruning weights that I see coming out of at least Pinot Noir production in Oregon. We have leaf area to yield. So leaf area to yield is a great, I would love to be able to get a better handle on this. Unfortunately, it's extremely difficult to quantify. We've done that as part of my research project, but I don't expect growers to spend the time in quantifying this. Pruning weights, if you can't do pruning weights, there's no way people are going to measure their leaf area. It's very tedious. But some of the recommendations currently in literature is that we need 0.8 to 1.2 square meters of canopy leaf area to a kilogram of fruit to ripen it to the optimum quality. And then we have the Rivaz index, which is probably the most practical of these, and that's really taking our yield and dividing that by our pruning weights. So those are two relatively easy things to measure. And the suggestion is that we have to have a 5 to 10 range and to get optimum fruit quality. That range seems rather large, in part because it's capturing a lot of different varieties and trying to come in a range that would be suitable for those. Unfortunately, that work was done in warmer climate varieties and in warmer climates, so California and Australia, and it works great there, but it's not necessarily even achievable in all locations. And the really critical thing, and I think a lot of you understand this, but in the lingo, my horticultural scientist colleagues, really, when we're in the room together talking about yield, we get confused because yield and crop load are the same thing in a lot of other crops, but in viticulture, yield is not equal to crop load. So there's a lot of confusion, even amongst researchers, when we look at apple literature and vice versa. So I'm going to talk mostly about this Rivaz index or the crop load, in part because it's a more practical measure that you guys can look at. I have a lot of data on leaf area to yield, and I'll tell you right now, I wish I could come up with a perfect curve. Unfortunately, I've not been able to do this. I've actually been able to develop curves, but out of the research that we've done, every year it's different. This is an example of one of those perfect, well-cited literature, in the literature of the research for crop load, looking at the leaf area to crop weight. And this is where we get the 0.8 to 1.2 square meters of canopy surface area, 2 kilograms of fruit. And this was work done on Cabernet Sauvignon, and this was published by Nick DeKuzlian and Mark Cleaver. So they did a lot of good work and a lot of good canopy management work that really has helped frame our understanding of vine balance, but it's not necessarily what we see here. So I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but I can tell you most of what I've seen in the many sites that we've done leaf area and yield quantification. Some were down in southern Oregon, some were up here in the Willamette Valley. We are well to the right end of this, so we are in about 2 square meters of canopy or higher. In some cases we could even be up to 5 per kilogram of fruit. So we get these curves, they're not as severe as this, and it's shifted far to the right. So we have much more canopy leaf area per our crop weight. And of course, this is cab, you can get more yield per unit canopy, it's much more fruitful than Pinot Noir. Yep.
Is that exposed leaf area or?
This is total. So the way that we do this is we actually quantify leaf area. We've done a non-destructive way where we use a template method, and we actually look at, in the past we would just do only a couple shoots per vine, do that on, and then extrapolate across that whole vine. But now we're embarking on trying to test some of these methods, and we've actually defoliated some vines this season. In fact, that's where everybody in my lab is all of last week and all of this week, is quantifying this, and just to do 32 vines, it's taken 3 weeks. So to run those in a leaf area meter, but it's really time prohibitive, cost prohibitive to do this on a large scale. And what our question is, how much of that really is functional? How much, when you have a big VSP canopy, what percentage of the leaves really are getting the majority of the sunlight? So there's different, that's why I'm not going to report on leaf area to yield yet, is I want to have better information available to know how to interpret it. But I'm going to talk about the crop load, the Rivaz index, the yield divided by pruning weight. So this is something that if you have not done this, everybody gets yield weights. So being able to pair that with pruning weights would be really important. How many of you currently do pruning weights? So good. At least it's better than yesterday's crowd. I have more convincing to do, I guess, for pruning weight. But I completely understand why people don't necessarily spend the time on it, because that's part of the research I'm working on, is to try to figure out whether it matters, what kind of metrics do we need to actually achieve good balance. So I looked in the literature, and for cool climates specifically, there's lots of warm climate data, but for Pinot Noir in cool climates, the Rivaz indices that have been reported, I have British Columbia up there, they've had between 8.3 and 14.2, which is pretty high. I've never seen that here in Oregon. Steve Castagnoli and Carmel Vasconcelos, they reported on some research that was done down at our Woodhull vineyard using 20 different clones of Pinot Noir, and they weren't amending crop level, they were just looking at what the vine was able to do, and their range over that 5 years of research was, their Rivaz was 2.5 to 4.2. So clearly, even a fully cropped Pinot Noir vine, all of the different clones that you could possibly grow here, at least at that research site, never even got into that 5 to 10 range. So we're looking at different metrics for Oregon. So there's a number of different crop load sites or crop load trials that I have done, and I embarked on these actually in 2010, which would have been the perfect season, 2010 and 2011, because they were cool years to do crop thinning research. And 2011 was a really big crop year. Did those trials up at Stoller Vineyard in Dundee, as well as down at Maple Ranch Vineyard, which is one of Forest Vineyard's properties, and did the same exact trial, looked at timing and intensity of crop thinning. So how early should we do crop thinning? Does it actually help us to hasten ripening if we do it earlier? And we started as early as pre-bloom, or at around bloom. And then we did fruit set, lag phase, veraison thinning. The results of that work basically showed, at least in southern Oregon, that we can get some gain by doing earlier crop thinning, but here in the Willamette Valley, it didn't matter what time we crop thinned, it really didn't make a difference in any of the 3 years that we did the research. So it didn't affect berry size, it didn't increase fruit set, it didn't affect the cluster size, it really didn't influence our fruit composition either. We made wines out of both of those, and we currently have those being analyzed through sensory work. So some of you might have been part of a sensory panel this past August, and we analyzed some of those wines, so we don't have the data to share at this point for that. Also in this trial, we found very few benefits of cluster thinning. So reducing yield really only got us 2 things. In our heaviest crop year, it increased our bricks by 1.2, and that was it. That was 2011. Other years, it was very small of difference, and the biggest change we saw across both sites would have been increase in anthocyanins. So we did have slightly more red color with just our cutting down to 1 cluster per shoot. We're having roughly a 25% reduction in crop. Going any further than that really didn't get us any additional gain in quality. So having done those research projects, I started another project because I realized that we were just changing one end of the equation on both of those vineyard sites. We were just amending or changing the yield. The second project I wanted to do is actually looking at yield adjustment in a trial that we also had at Stoller, where we had modified vine vigor levels through using vineyard floor management tactics. So we had moderate vigor, moderate high vigor, and very high vigor, and we imposed the crop thinning over that. That research, it gets very, very complex, and we're continuing that work actually. And we basically were able to come up with different curves of leaf area to yield ratios and also different crop loads. But one of the interesting findings there is it didn't matter what we did in terms of crop thinning, the vines were auto-regulating their crop already. So they were starting to have reduced number of berries, a number of flowers per inflorescence, and actually changed their fruitfulness. And that was driven largely by nitrogen. So that story is interesting, and I'll be reporting on that another time. And I expanded further into the statewide crop load project that many of you may be aware of, because I realized the limitation of just doing this work at 2 sites, and that may not be representative of other vineyards. And over the years, there's been a lot of research done in a lot of different areas of the world on cluster thinning and different permutations of canopy management for yield management, but the results are all over the board. There's no definitive result, and a lot of growers tend to still do what they think is right for their own vineyard. There's not a clear idea of what's the best route to go in terms of, do I cluster thin or not? And most people would assume the more you cluster thin, the more you can hasten ripening and the better quality you're going to have. That's the general consensus, and that's also what the Oregon industry has said, at least in surveys, what is happening here. So I said, why aren't people considering this other avenue of looking at crop load? And it's probably because people have not done the research in their own vineyards to try this out. So the statewide crop load project is focusing on Pinot Noir only at this point. In the future, we may expand to other varieties. But the project, unfortunately, is not all the way across the state. It's mainly in the Willamette Valley. And we have 15 vineyards it's employed in at the present time. 1 in Marion County, 3 in Polk County, and 11 in Yamhill. So they span across 5 different AVAs. And here's a list of the collaborators in the project, and this work has also been very helpful to have the fruit analyzed by ETS Labs. They've done it actually for free for the 2011 and 2013, and just confirmed this week they will do it for 2014. So those of you in the project, they'll cover the charge on that. I think that's pretty significant contribution they're providing there. We also worked with Wilco in 2012 or 2013, and now Crop Production Services in 2014 to help us gather our nutrient samples for this project. So we're looking at vine growth, so pruning weights, yields, fruitfulness, as well as vine nutrition. We're looking at the fruit composition, and we'll also do wine sensory analysis. And for those of you who aren't necessarily aware of this project, I don't have just the army of students going out to each of the vineyards and doing this. This is actually work that the vineyard managers and the winemakers are involved with directly. So we set up protocols, and they actually follow the protocols, and they've done very well. I've been really impressed by the collaborators. And they get the research data collected, and they submit it to OSU, and we work on statistical analysis, interpretation, and then reporting back to the industry and folks like yourself here today with the results. So it really is an active research project. So some of the results, I don't talk tons per acre for the results, and that frustrates some people, but if you understand, we're working across 15 different vineyards. Tons per acre is not the lowest lowest common denominator. We have to report by pounds per foot, just to be talking the same equation here because of different vineyard design. Not everybody had the same vine spacing and the same row spacing. So the yields, 2012 was a lower yielding year than 2013. Most of the vineyards in the project had used different cluster thinning regimes. There's some who chose to use target yield per acre, but for the majority they were using these cluster thinning regimes shown on the x-axis there. Half cluster per shoot, the fewest people did that one. 1 cluster per shoot, most people did that. 1.5 cluster per shoot, 2 clusters per shoot, or no thinning at all. And one of the things we found is that depending on the year and the fruitfulness level, we may only have 1.5 clusters per shoot. So the 1.5, 2 cluster, or no thinning treatments in a lot of cases have very similar yields. You can see there, there's a slight increase as you go to the right, but the error bars show that they're not very much different. So oftentimes that came true with respect to the results in the fruit chemistry. But we certainly do see a significant enough crop reduction with the 1 cluster per shoot and of course the half cluster per shoot in comparison. So we were able to achieve different yields to test the result on the vines. We also were able to alter crop load on each site, but I would just want to point out what range of crop loads we were able to achieve. And remember, this is yield divided by pruning weight. And here is the 2012 data, and this is just the average for each site. You can see that there's a very different range of crop loads even represented in the study. So Adelsheim there is the lowest. That means they were the biggest canopies relative to the amount of fruit. Bethel Heights, Kenrick Cellars, Carter Macron, some of those in the middle there, they had more fruit per their canopy. So the higher the bar actually has the more fruit relative to the size of the canopy. And of course you can see there that almost every site is below that what's considered optimum. We're not even able to achieve that crop load. We're much lower than that. And here is the results for year 2, so 2013. This has all of the vineyard sites shown, and I just want to point out again the optimum there. And you can see it's hard to read for you, probably read the different individual vineyards there, but like here's an example for A to Z. They have, this is their range of crop load that they're able to achieve using their different crop thinning levels, and same with some of the others. There's, on a given site, there's going to be differences in how different their cropping levels will affect their total crop load. And really, I show this figure to help people try to conceptualize crop load because it's not a straightforward concept. And this is actually just the data from 2012 showing each vineyard and showing their yield and their pruning weight side by side. And this right here is just showing the range between their pruning weight and their yield. So at this site here, it's a pretty big difference, that differential between the two. So if we look down here, here's another vineyard, and that difference is much smaller. So that's what we're really trying to see, what impact those differences between those two ends of the equation will influence fruit quality over time. So I don't have the answer to what all this means, but I'm hoping that people will go home and think differently about this and maybe start thinking more about the other end of the equation, not just the yield end of the equation. So impacts on fruit quality. I can at least report to date on our fruit composition from 2012 and 2013. So there's two ends of those equations. There's yield, so how much fruit we have out there, the vine size, which here I'm referring to as pruning weight, and then our crop load. So which one do you think mattered more in terms of all the different things we can look at fruit chemistry or fruit composition? Anybody, any brave souls want to guess? Vine size? Right, that's good. I want you to be brave. Any other guesses? Anybody want to argue against that? No brave souls? Yeah. Good, you were listening. You know. Crop load. Nobody wants to pick yield. Well, of course, both of you are in the trial, so it's smart that you're not picking yield. Well, it depends on the situation. But because you are brave souls, and those of you who go to my talks, you know that I give prizes to the brave souls. So they can choose one of the two prizes. And the prizes is a IPM book that we put together a couple of years ago, or an extension notebook. So you can choose your, that's a $35 value right there, Ken. Chad.
Was he right?
He was. Both Chad and Ken were right. So, and the question then we have is, which crop load component is more important? So when crop load does come out as statistically significant, we want to know, well, did managing the yield or did managing the pruning weights or our vine size make more of a difference, or is it both? And that you can look at. So in 2012, the importance of canopy or the vine size, I chose to just show some of the fruit chemistry data that came back from our ETS reports. And because crop load was important, I broke it down as to whether pruning weight or yield in these situations were influenced. If there's neither X in there, that means crop load, nor pruning weight, nor yield influenced it. So total soluble solids up there really wasn't affected by whether you crop thinned or not, and whether you had bigger vine size or higher pruning weights or lower pruning weights. So when we looked at color, we had the polymeric anthocyanins. Actually, we expected those to be influenced more, partly because of our prior research projects showed that we had higher polymeric anthocyanins when we crop thinned more. So whether we had more or less pruning weights, it didn't matter. But in that year, we had, in 2012, our total anthocyanins were higher based on whether we crop thin. So crop thinning does help increase our anthocyanins or our red color, and we could actually see that in some of our first wines that were produced. In fact, because of that, if you do a sensory tasting for this project, we have it in black glasses. So you cannot be influenced by just the color alone. But we know that color is important, and we are doing the sensory analysis both with and without color to see how much is color driving somebody's decision as to the quality. So if that's true, if what color is driving it, then that means that crop thinning is really valuable because people are going to perceive that as higher quality. So we know that it's increasing the anthocyanins, but it's both that vine vigor, or that canopy size, and the crop level. Mouthfeel components, we looked at phenolics, and we were able to increase some of those, but it really had nothing to do with our crop thinning. It had everything to do with our canopy size, so our pruning weight. Fermentation, we look at YAN, so yeast assimilable nitrogen, our amino acids, and our ammonia. We found that both our crop thinning had an influence, so if we did crop thin, it conserved some nitrogen, especially for those sites that tend to be lower in nitrogen. But it also was influenced by canopy size. That makes sense, because your bigger canopies, more vigorous vines are going to typically have more nitrogen and thus more in the fruit. And we did see an effect of vine size on malic acid in 2012. So here's a relationship I wanted to show for YANs, because I know a lot of Pinot Noir producers are concerned about having low YANs or not quite enough. And here, as we increased our crop level, or our Ravaz, so increasing yields will increase our Ravaz index. We did have a decrease in YAN. So in some cases that was to a level that people were not happy with the wine, so that's where we think it's more of that vine balance equation of really looking at the vineyard and adjusting yields appropriately. And this is a plot of pruning weight influence on quercetin, and quercetin is a compound that is influenced by sunlight. A lot of the research will show that pretty specifically, and we think that basically this had more to do with a vine's vigor level and the size of the canopy rather than any crop thinning that we did. And this is going to be more a result of potentially long-term, if you're having a decrease in vine size with heavier crop levels, we may actually see this reverse with crop thinning. In 2013, we had slightly different results. This is not uncommon with year by year or vintage by vintage. We actually saw an increase in polymeric anthocyanins, and these are the more stable anthocyanins in 2013 by crop thinning. So it didn't matter of our canopy size, but crop thinning certainly did increase our polymeric anthocyanins. Again, we saw an effect on some of our mouthfeel components, our phenolics, but this time we did not see any influence on tannins, but we see that it's not influenced by our cluster thinning practices, but only by our vine size, whereas in the year prior, cluster thinning assisted or helped with this to some degree. We also saw that there was no influence on our thinning on our YANs, or our amino acids in the fruit. So that was really interesting that 1 year the cluster thinning had an influence, and second year it was really more so with the situation of the vine size. That probably has a lot to do with vine vigor, because how many of you have observed vigor differences year in and year out in the vineyard? Yeah, so we get this huge drift or shift in our vigor, and managing nitrogen in the fruit I think is going to be a tricky thing in the future to consider. And malic acid again was influenced, but last year we saw it influenced by our cluster thinning as well. So here I wanted to show the plot of the polymeric anthocyanins, because I do think this has probably got an influence on our wine aroma or our wine color. And so as we increased our yield, we do get a decrease in the polymeric anthocyanins. The question I have for my chemistry colleagues is how much of a shift is it important to see a color difference? And according to Jungmin Lee, one of the phenolic chemists, said that we can see a shift pretty quickly with even a 2 milligrams per liter difference. So it'll be a visible thing for you to see. I think she normally gives me an example of, 3 milligrams per liter of anthocyanins is like looking at cranberry juice. So that color difference is about how much you can see in the shift. So it might seem trivial in this plot, but even going a half ton less, or I shouldn't say half ton, but half a pound less per foot could increase our anthocyanins. At least that's the way it's looking so far from not only this project, but another project other projects we've done. And here's, I wanted to show this plot of YANs for 2013, because this kind of flip-flopped as I showed before. 2012 it was influenced by our yield management, but 2013 it was not. It was only by pruning weight, and that probably had to do with a higher vigor year. So higher vigor, higher pruning weights, and we had higher YANs. So it had more to do with our canopy size relative to our fruit. So a summary of the crop load research to date. This is a long-term venture, so it'll take a while to get better, more clear recommendations for industry. But the vine size or the crop load has been influenced by potassium, but that's certainly something that we've been decreasing with increasing yields, and our malic acid is also being decreased. And also, we are going to continue sensory evaluation of these wines. The beauty of this work is that you guys and the collaborators are producing the wines. I'm not. Or a student at Oregon State University is not, because when we do our small-scale wine production from our very small projects, they're only a gallon or 3 to 5 gallon, and they're a totally different animal. And this is so great to have the collaborators producing these wines at a commercial scale that can be evaluated both by consumers and by experts. So we're going to do a large consumer panel to really look at these wines, also for price points. So we realize that everybody's probably making good wine, but now do we see there's a relationship with yield management, quality, style, and price point, but also looking at it by an expert panel too to get more analytical data from that, or quantitative data from that. And what is the optimum crop load at this point? We don't know, but I do know that for sure we cannot use the 5 to 10 metric. We just can't even achieve it in many cases. So here are the 4 different studies that I've got going on crop load, and we have everything from the lowest being 0.32 as a crop load, which is very large canopies and low crop level, to our highest was 9.8, which happened to be in southern Oregon, where they had irrigated vines. I've never seen that high here in the Willamette Valley. The highest we had in the Willamette Valley was 3.8, so barely knocking on the door of 4 is what we've had off of the statewide crop load project. And some of the vineyards that have been the highest crop load, so to get to that 3.8, have been actually far too stressed. So too many buds per linear foot of canopy, too short of shoots, and they're to a point that they're sick. They need to be. We actually had to step back, adjust their cropping level, and actually do some amendments to try to ramp up fruitfulness in those project sites. So I think, Chris, do I have enough time that I can move on? Okay. So the second, I'll just address additional questions at lunch on crop load if you have more. The other topic that Eckhard wanted me to talk about was nutrient management for young vines, and I'm going to keep this more general because it's really difficult to give clear recommendations for sites because everybody's site is slightly different. But nutrient management of young vines is really critical because they are so small. They're babies. And you really want to give them everything that you can in the beginning and not stress them out. You can worry about that later once they're grown up. So once they're past their wiry teenage years and they're adults, we can send them out on their own to figure it out. But until then, we've got to give them some guidance. And it really is pretty simple. The most important one is weed control. I don't know how many times I've been contacted as extension specialists from people all over the state asking, what's wrong with my vines? And I tell them to send me a picture, because a picture is worth 1,000 words, and they're worried about something crazy, and here they've got weeds growing up all around them. They're just completely stressed. So weed control is the absolute number one. And I don't think people realize those weeds are using water, are using nutrients, and they're going to outcompete. That's why they're weeds. Irrigation is really important. A lot of people here in the Willamette Valley, I think, pretty much try to do some level of irrigating young vines, and that's critical. And fertilization, there's different ways that we can get at that fertilization, and I'll talk about some of those. But vineyard floor management is really critical. A lot of folks would say they never want to plant a vineyard with some sort of cover crop. That's not true. You can do it as long as you maintain an herbicide strip. I know when I first came to Oregon, a lot of people were bare tilling their young vineyard plantings. ODA called me and said, why are they doing this? And I say, because they want to. I'm not a policy maker. I'm not a regulator. I can't get them in trouble. But then I started doing some work with planting young vineyards with cover crops. But there's some great data out there, simple studies that have been done where it shows that you have to just maintain a weed-free area around the vines to ensure that they're getting what they need in the root system. So avoiding weed competition, here's a good example of where they were more concerned about tilling the between row space, but then they had ample weed growth in the vine row. But here's a picture of a grower in Southern Oregon that wanted to do absolutely everything right, and he planted a sod cover in the middle of the vine row, and then maintained a 3 to 4 foot wide herbicide strip, and was able to cut down his irrigation that he used on a weekly basis by doing so, and the vineyard looks great. And of course, using herbicides is really important, and a lot of times weed control, it doesn't have to include herbicide use, but a lot of times it does. And one of the things I run into is a lot of people damaging their young vines with using the wrong herbicide. And a lot of times we talk 2,4-D, and it drives me nuts because it's not just 2,4-D, it's the synthetic auxins or the hormone herbicides, as well as the ALS inhibitors. So there's different classes, and there's a lot of different compounds that fall into those classes, and those are shown on the right, and 2,4-D is only one of them. And a lot of people would say, well, I didn't spray 2,4-D, or you don't have to. You use dicamba or tricloper, that's going to do a number on the vineyards too. So, if you are at all concerned about this, read the label. I can't stress that enough. I know it's really tedious and it's very small print, but you can find most of these online in label databases, or with your smartphone you could look them up and read the label and find out, is it actually going to cause problems to grapes. And that's the beauty of electronic reading of labels, is you can do search words and look for grape, and you can find there's a warning there. So just be careful when managing that in the vineyard. Also, another consideration for vines is the rootstock effect. There's a lot of different rootstocks out there. Of course, most of the growers here use Riparia Glor 3309 or 10114, and it's just good to keep in mind that different rootstocks will have different nitrogen requirements. At least we believe that at this point, a lot of the vigor that they confer or take away from vines has to do with the nitrogen uptake. And most of the ones we've selected for Oregon are because they're devigorating, but they have a medium or medium high nitrogen uptake. And that's probably why nobody uses Freedom here, or some of the other ones that have very high nitrogen uptake and would also lead to significant vigor. So just keep those things in mind too when managing young vines. And a lot of people want to grow their nitrogen with a cover crop, which is actually a sound practice up here because we've got ample soil moisture, and by the time you get a cover crop incorporated or a green manure, you've got enough soil moisture to allow mineralization and the availability of that nitrogen. But just keep in mind that some of the commonly used cover crops can supply quite a bit of nitrogen to a young vineyard. So or to a vineyard period, but in a young vineyard they could be used to add nitrogen in, but you might want to take those out once you get into a more established stage. So crimson clover, which a lot of people plant, if it's a solid stand, can provide about 162 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year, which is quite substantial. But of course, it's not the same as throwing down 162 pounds of urea. It's not going to be readily available as quickly, but you certainly can see that impact over time. So it's a catch-22. When they're young vines, you can definitely use cover crops managed appropriately to provide nitrogen, but also you have to keep in mind that an actively growing cover crop, even if it does provide nitrogen, can compete at some stage for water and nutrients as well. So it's kind of a fine balance there. And here's a figure that I just wanted to show to keep in mind not only potential fertilization practices, but also the vineyard floor work that you would consider in a young vineyard. And this was actually work done at Oregon State, preceded my time here, but it was done in the 80s, and they worked on a 2-year-old new planting down at our Woodhall Research Vineyard. And they looked at either doing bare soil or tilling between the vine rows, putting in a sod and mowing it, or having a sod cover between the rows and then leaving it unmowed. And they also added nitrogen back in because they didn't want to kill the vines outright, so they looked at rate of urea fertilization. And if you look at the 0 on the left-hand side, if there was no urea applied, having the bare soil significantly increased the amount of vine tissue nitrogen that they had. So this is reporting the tissue nitrogen, also resulted in larger vine size or vine growth. But as you look at the, in order to get to close that gap between the difference between whether you had bare soil or had a cover crop, they had to add nitrogen. So they added 122 pounds of N per acre, and they were able to close that gap somewhat between the unmowed unmowed grass and the bare soil, and by the time they reached 244 pounds of nitrogen per acre, there was no difference. But that's a lot of nitrogen they're adding back into the system even to get there. So if you are using a bare soil, a grass cover in a young vineyard system, you could be at diminishing returns because that grass will use up a lot of nitrogen that's being cycled by that soil. So you will have to fertilize. That's just something to keep in mind. But that's a nice plot. Then, of course, the question about irrigation and fertilization comes into play, especially for a lot of new vineyards that are going in areas that don't necessarily have water available to them, and they want to be dry farmed. And this is a project I did actually. Morgan, the graduate student who was on this project, sitting right there, he worked on this project for the last 2 years of it. We did it from 2009 to 2012, and Dean Underwood was our grower collaborator on this as well, and Dean's over there. This was a very unique project that we grew cover crops to create enough biomass to put back into the vine row as a mulch. And the goals were really to try to increase soil moisture conservation and increase potentially some nitrogen available to those young vines and increase growth and establishment. And this was a dry farmed site. They had no water available to them on site, but we monitored soil moisture and water stress, and we were going to report to Dean if we absolutely needed to get water on those vines. Luckily, we did not need to irrigate this site for the duration of the project. But the vines were planted in summer of 2008. They are Chardonnay, so this is the only research project I have to date that was not on Pinot Noir, so that was kind of nice. And we planted a winter annual cover crop of crimson clover and rye, and we were able to generate a lot of mulch, or a lot of biomass the first year of the project, and we were able to put that in the vine row. So there in the picture you can see those young vines with that mulch layer added. We did that in May. And what we did in the first 2 years of the study is we interplanted young vines that we could then pull out and destructively harvest, so we can weigh the whole thing and get an idea of how much more growth we had with a mulch or not with a mulch. And we didn't want to harvest Dean's vines, so we had to do that. We just put cuttings in and grew those out. And so there's one of the vines that's interplanted between the actual vines. And we cut them at the base of the soil, harvested those at the end of the season, and we looked at the biomass generated. And here's the dry weight of the mulched ones at the right here, compared to the ones where we either didn't have any cover crop planted, we removed the cover crop biomass, or we just did a normal tillage of the alleyway. So we were able to increase our biomass quite a bit in the first 2 years of the project. We carried it through 4 years. Here's the beginning of year 3. We were able to get those established to the fruiting wire, and the end of year 3 we had already a full canopy. So this was a really healthy vineyard. Long-term results of this study, we were able to reduce weed growth by using the mulch. We were also able to reduce compaction of the soil in that zone. We did increase our vine biomass, largely of our canopy and our roots, and it was interesting that that effect was seen mostly in those first couple of years. By the time we got to year 4, we looked at the legacy effects, and there weren't that many after that. So it's a localized, both in spatially and temporally, the effect of the mulch. And we had increases in yield or fruitfulness that we saw as a result, which probably would lend it to, or suggest that it's nitrogen. We got more nitrogen into those vines, although the nitrogen results weren't very clear that we had increased tissue nitrogen. And I wanted to talk about compost here just briefly as a fertilizer too, because a lot of times people think of compost and mulch. Mulch is really more so there to help with soil moisture conservation. Compost is really more of a low-level nutrient addition. And it's hard for me to talk, a lot of people have interest in this, but it's hard for me to talk about this very specifically because compost can come from a lot of different sources and have a lot of different analysis. So the best thing I can say there is really look into the different composts that you have available to you and determine what it is that you want to, a good reliable source of compost that year in and year out you could use, rather than just kind of hitting and missing with what type of product you might be using. But certainly people have been successful at using compost as a nutrient addition in young vineyards. The question about tissue testing often comes up, when's too early to start? Is it ever too early to start tissue testing? One of the things I say is that tissue testing is always better than soil testing alone, because it gives you an idea of what your vines are actually taking up. And I like to have people start that process early. You don't want to start too early, like, because if you plant them one year, you don't want to take it the same year, but you can start taking your tissue samples that following year. And just start that process early, especially identifying problem vines, especially now with the virus concerns. People are concerned whether a red leaf is virus or if a red leaf is nutrition. And there's only one way to narrow that down. You can't do a visual assessment and say, aha, that's virus or nutrition. You've actually got to test it. So yesterday, one of the participants in the field day there had a really nice display of red leaves, but you can't just look at them and say it's nitrogen or it's red blotch. It really could be either of them. So without this kind of information, you can't rule it out. And one of the key things I really like to explain with young vines is consider that when you're taking your sample from a young vine versus an older vine, that sometimes even if there's a problem, your levels of the nutrients might look okay. They might come back as sufficient. And the reason is the vine size. So a stressed vine or a young vine is much smaller. So your data you get back from a nutrient analysis is a percentage. It's not a content. So it might be conserving nitrogen, for example, and it might be at a sufficient level, but you can see that the vine is stressed, or small leaves, or lack of growth, versus one that's really vigorous, and its percent nitrogen may be actually looking a little bit like it's deficient, but you look at it and you're thinking, no, this is really vigorous. So you've got to use the data that you get back with observations from the vineyard. They themselves alone, if you're just handing it over to somebody that's never seen the vines, then they can't make a educated decision on how to help you. It really needs to be comparing your actual growth in the field with the testing. And if you want more information about grapevine nutrition, this is one of the most extensive sources of publicly available information on vine nutrition. I spent a lot of time putting this together with the help of my colleague Paul Schreiner. And this is a nutrient module online, and you can go there and get access to a lot of different information on grapevine nutrition. So you can just search grapevine nutrition OSU, and you should be able to find that. You can also look on our website, owri.oregonstate.edu, and you should be able to find it, or just contact me. I'd be happy to get you to the site. So I want to thank you for inviting me, Eckhard, and providing you guys with this more formal opportunity to talk about my research. I know a lot of you see me around, but we don't necessarily go through the research results. And I just want to wrap up with just a general overview of the OWRI, the Oregon Wine Research Institute. Yesterday, Mark Chen, our program coordinator, was able to do this talk down in Roseburg, but he couldn't be here today, so then Eckhard asked me to just give you guys an update. And a lot of you have worked with people at OSU and the USDA ARS that are partners with us, so you're probably somewhat familiar with the OWRI. But this is really the functional model. The people that have been at Oregon State University that worked on grape, there's a number of us, myself included. There's James Osborne, the enology extension specialist, Elizabeth Tomasino, who works with wine sensory, and then Laurent Deluc, who works with grape metabolomics. So we're kind of the core four people at OSU, but there's other people who work only with grape too. So Paul Schreiner from USDA ARS works in vine nutrition. Walt Mahaffey, many of you know, works on fungal diseases of grapevine, and Bob Martin, who works with viruses of a number of different crops. But we're kind of the core unit that works on research, extension, and education. A lot of us also teach in our undergraduate program. So we're the center of the whole institute. So kind of like, you know, I had to use a picture. I think it works better. You know, we're the core, we're the leaf blade. We do all the work. And there's also, so we're the heart of the institute, or the leaf blade of the institute. And of course the institute is just one of many programs at the university, so the university is the whole vine, and we're the leaf. And we've got associate faculty too, and they kind of are like the lobes. They do a little bit, they're at the fringes. They help with and they really complement the core work. So Michael Chen is a good example. He works on other food products, but he largely has been my collaborator on wine aroma. So he's an associate faculty member, and we've got Jay Scheit, for example. Many of you know him. He works on a lot of different crops. He's the extension pathologist. So he's one of the associate members. And then, of course, we've got our newly hired program coordinator, Mark Chen. And also many of you might know Danielle Gabriel. She's now our communications and outreach manager to really help us get all of the stuff that we currently do out to you guys. So you guys are already aware of hopefully of our website and our technical newsletter. We're continuing to do those, but we're hoping to do more of that kind of stuff. So they're helping with that. And so they're really like the patio. They really aren't doing the heart of the viticulture and enology work, but they're helping keeping us connected to the vine and really getting us communicating with industry and the rest of the university and policy makers and things like that. So that's kind of the model of the OWRI. We've actually been in existence for quite some time now. And if you have any questions about the OWRI, you can just let me know, and hopefully this clears up any confusion that people may have had. And really our main goal is to do more of what we've been doing, and that's doing a lot of research that's valuable to you guys as the industry, and really partnering with you. And some of the projects like the statewide crop load project was actually funded by a pilot project program of the OWRI when we first got established. So that was actually not originally like wine board dollars, that was OWRI dollars that got that project started. So there's a number of other projects like that too, an NPK project that Paul Schreiner's been doing. We've been able to take that project that was originally funded by his USDA monies and get more canopy research done, as well as some sensory and wine chemistry work done on that project. So you'll be hearing more about that. We're actually in year 3 of that project this year, and hopefully we'll have more recommendations for nutrient guidelines that lead to that link to fruit and wine quality. So that's it, and I want to thank you, and hopefully I didn't go too far over time, and I'm happy to address questions at lunch, so we can